Mike, thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk about board committees today.
Thanks. Not everyone's excited to talk about board committees, but I'm one of those people. So thanks for having us.
All right. Well, I trust that you're going to make it a riveting conversation. And I feel like we should start with giving people, just a little bit of incentive to listen to the rest of this podcast. Why do you think committees are so important for charter school boards?
Well, without getting into too much background, my work in the organization I work with, we experience and observe hundreds of school boards across the country. And really the difference between some of those really great boards we work with and some that sort of just bump along often comes down to committees. Because what we're talking about is governing a multi-million-dollar business in a lot of ways. And so if you do this simple calculation that if boards meet monthly, except for maybe twice a year, maybe they take off a December or July meeting, that's 10 meetings per year. And if they only meet for 2 hours, that's 20 hours to govern a multi-million-dollar business. And it's just not possible. So the way we do that is by delegating a lot of that work to committees.
All right. Well, that was a good primer. So tell us a little bit about who you are, why you care about boards, the organization you work for.
Yeah, awesome. Well, my name is Mike. I am the Chief Governance Officer with an organization called BoardOnTrack. We are, at our heart, one of the nation's first charter school governance coaching groups. Our founder literally wrote the books on charter school governance. And now we are part of a really great organization called Transact Communications, which partners with school organizations across the country to help with compliance, management, efficiency, just to help the organization thrive. By my heart, I'm a governance geek. I'm an attorney by trade. I've served on boards. And so this is what I love to do. And our organization, like I said, partners with hundreds of boards across the country to do exactly what we're talking about today.
So you mentioned the real differentiator between successful boards and those that maybe don't see the same results is this idea of committees and really building effective committees that actually go and do the work between the, 2 hours a month or whatever it is that actually happen at that board meeting. Could you talk to us a little bit about the difference between an effective and an ineffective board committee? Like, give us some basics here.
Sure. Well, one example that we see frequently are what we call paper committees, which are committees that are in your bylaws. And so when we ask, what committees do you have? They rattle off, 5 or 6 committees.
Whatever's on the paper.
Or whatever's enlisted in the bylaws. But then when we ask, what those committees do, they usually say, well, they meet here and there, as needed. And so, usually the difference between a really, engaged committee is that it's got real work that's built into the workflow of the broader board and management team. So the committees really should be where the magic happens between the work of the CEO and her team, all of the staff, and the work of the governing board members. This is where experts, for example, not to turn the page, but something like the finance committee. That's where the expert board members who, might be a CPA can really get into the weeds with the budget manager or the CFO on building out the budget and overseeing it over time. And so that's really what you want is a committee that doesn't just meet here or there, but has real work that rolls up to the work of the full board and the staff.
I'm guessing there's someone listening to this who's maybe a CEO or a founder, and they're thinking, wait a second, do we just have paper committees? Or they're doing the math in their head, evaluating their board. What would you say, you alluded to it a little bit, but what would you say are maybe flags or warning signs that your organization has maybe committees in name only?
Yeah, so I think typically there's a lot of symptoms that we hear, right? That lead us to ask the question, well, do you have real committees that are meeting? Oftentimes we hear that the board doesn't actually do any real work, or just the full board meetings are way too long. Our board meetings are going on for 3 hours, and we ask why, and it's because they're doing all of this complex work, strategic planning work, real project management at the full board level, instead of taking the time to do what we call, which is, the board's form should follow its function. So the committees that you have should follow the function that you've all agreed the board needs to do. So there should be a moment where the board sits down with the staff and says, what do we need to accomplish in the next year or 3 years? And do we have the committees to do those things? And if we don't, set up the committees. And if we do, make sure that they have real goals that they're working on an annual basis.
Why do you think it's such an easy trap to fall into to do the actual work across the whole board, or trying to get into the weeds in that board meeting? What's the inertia that pulls boards this direction?
Well, I think it can be a few things. Oftentimes, and not everyone likes to talk about it, but sometimes you just don't have the right people on the bus.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's hard to have a committee if you don't have committee members who are willing to show up. And so one of the things when a organization comes to us, maybe that CEO who's listening and says, I want to have committees, we just haven't gotten there yet. Oftentimes it comes down to, are the board members expecting this when they join the board? So we encourage you, in a job description or a board member agreement, before you've actually even joined the board, make it very clear that they're expected to attend a monthly committee meeting in addition to that full monthly board meeting. And oftentimes it's as simple as just managing expectations from the outset.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about committees that you feel like play a really important role when it comes to charter school governance. We've kind of made the case that committees do a lot of the real work between the monthly board meetings. Which committees, every board has their own bylaws or whatever you want to call it. Which committees do you and your team consider essential, or do you find yourselves recommending? I think the one maybe everyone jumps to is like the finance committee, but what are some of the other committees that you see out there or that schools should be considering having?
Well, I love the way you phrased it, because there's the 5 standing committees that we recommend. And then I'll say that there are some that I think are, frankly, selfishly more essential than others.
Okay.
Without going too far into like the nerdy legal world, I do think it's important for people to know when we say standing committee, we're talking about those committees that are listed specifically in your bylaws, which means they're not easy to change, right? So they're expected to essentially be there semi-permanently unless we amend the bylaws and go down that process. Typically, we find now, again, after doing this for a couple decades, that there are 5 committees that most boards need. Those are the finance committee, the governance committee, the development or a fundraising committee, the CEO support and evaluation committee, and what we call the academic excellence committee. And those are typically the 4 or 5. I would say if an organization was asking us right now on this call, what do I start with? I think selfishly, I would say the governance committee, because that's almost running air traffic control on the philosophy of implementing the additional committees. I think beyond that, I think anyone would argue that the finance committee and the academic committee have to be the next 2 that you implement before going off from there.
Let's start with, let's pick one of these. Let's say the finance committee, for example, one of these core standing committees. Every board has one. What are some of the signs of a high functioning finance committee? I think the typical knock on the finance committee would be, well, they just look at the, P&L report or whatever financial audits get bubbled up, once a quarter, and they ask a question or 2. And then it's like, all right, we haven't run out of money. Great. Like on to the next thing. So tell us a little bit about what a really high functioning finance committee could look like.
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of things. I think it first starts with the right people. So when you're recruiting a board, you got to make sure that you are thinking about a well-balanced board. That means, I like to admit, I went to law school because I am not a finance guy. Numbers, they don't come to me naturally. So you want to balance having somebody like me on the board, who's really maybe a more of a policy wonk, with somebody who either has worked on a school budget before or is a CPA or, again, can read budget to actuals and audit reports and things like that. I think a good sign that the finance committee is doing its job, there are the red flags, right? That there's no major crises, right? That the school can operate sustainably, that there are no, instances or sniffs of like waste, fraud, and abuse, that kind of stuff. But a really great committee would be a committee where the board members who aren't even on the finance committee are still well-versed on the organization's finances. That means that finance committee is not only doing its job in helping to oversee the budget and the audits and all of that, but they're bringing their colleagues on the rest of the board with them.
What should committee activities and the relationship with school leadership look like? And we could go along this, if you want to stick with the finance committee example, or just more broadly, should committees always have, direct operational leaders from the school involved in them? What does that relationship look like? What are maybe some best practices you've seen? in how committees can work hand in hand with leadership and not sort of be off on their own coming up with ideas?
Well, I think that's the key thing here. You not be doing that, right? You want to make sure, again, that it's a well-orchestrated machine here between the work that the staff is doing, the work of the board, and the committees often are in the middle. And so to answer the first part of your question, I think the relationship can evolve over time. So, for example, a new charter school, it'd be naive to think that the staff is robust enough to have, a C-suite for each one of these.
Right.
So it might be the CEO who is really helping to draft the budget. But anybody who's served on a board before knows that, if you tried to draft a budget from a blank spreadsheet to a final budget together as the full board, you just never get there. So the finance committee, is an opportunity for the finance people to get into the weeds and to do most of the drafting of the budget. And this is where you can marry those board members on the committee are highlighting and strategically focusing on the board's priorities, whereas the staff experts, whether it's the CEO to begin with and eventually hopefully grows to be a CFO or a budget manager, they can identify what's realistic and what needs to be in the budget that, the board members might not be expert enough to know about. And it's sort of the magic that happens between those expert staff members partnering with lay people who might have a nod towards finance that help to, make an efficient organization run.
I know you guys work with hundreds and hundreds of school boards. I'd love for you to maybe give us a real world example. You don't have to name names, but maybe if you have an example that comes to mind of a committee that helped drive change at an organization, because I think ultimately, that's the goal, is that outcomes are actually being shifted positively. Do you have a real world example you could give us of how a committee can have real lasting impact on an organization?
Yeah, again, I think obviously if there is an organization that is looking to evolve and they're looking to develop as a team, I would say to start with the governance committee, because if you're not able to get that committee right, it, sort of begs the question whether the rest will ever follow and whether you'll ever be able to get to another place. One other thing that I'll highlight that is not as obvious as to some people is the role of a CEO support and evaluation committee. Most boards, they treat their relationship with the CEO as something that is just expected to happen, that we're just going to all get along and we'll figure it out together. And they treat the evaluation, the formal evaluation at the end of the year, as just a one-time a year thing. They gather a report, they sign a letter, and they pat themselves on the back. We've seen that one of the committees that can pay off the biggest dividends is a committee that treats that relationship as an ongoing working thing that they need to support. And they meet, maybe not as frequent as monthly, but they meet with the CEO on at least a quarterly basis to really support that partnership. And again, organizations, especially charter organizations, are made up of the CEO and the staff and the board on the other side. And they usually are not investing in that relationship to the extent that they ought to be.
Okay, I want to ask some hard questions.
All right.
About maybe awkward realities in navigating board relationships. And I'm kind of asking this from the CEO staff side of the equation you just laid out. How do you approach having the wrong person in the wrong seat? So one of the things you mentioned is that, committees can be make or break depending on the people that you have running those committees. How do you navigate that as a CEO if you want to make a change around committee leadership?
So just to tie back to the last thing we were talking about, the CEO Support and Evaluation Committee is the perfect intimate avenue for the CEO to raise issues with the governance team. That is the perfect area where it's usually the CEO, a board chair, maybe one or two other officers. That could be a really great opportunity to flag that maybe the finance committee chairperson or treasurer maybe isn't the right person for that job. And again, then you can address that. We're big believers in our group that data-driven governance is the way to lead. And so we're big believers in assessing the team as best as you can to figure out where issues might lie. So on the staff side, I think it can be pretty obvious, right? If your audit report is rife with, issues and red flags, if your budget to actuals aren't making sense, if you're not able to deliver the monthly financial reports the way you should, that's going to be a pretty obvious thing that needs to be addressed on the staff side. I think to your point, having these volunteer board members, it's maybe a little bit more difficult to do that. But there are ways to assess the board, to have conversations at either the governance committee or, like we mentioned, the CEO support and evaluation committee to suss out these kind of issues that might exist.
Do you ever see a unique committee established for a unique challenge an organization is facing?
Totally. I mean, I'm still surprised, even, been working for BoardOnTrack for almost 8 years now, and I'm still surprised when I review bylaws or meet with boards on the ingenuity that exists out there. But that's sort of what is a hallmark of charter schools, right? Is that they're these entrepreneurial, creative organizations. So there are always committees that we haven't run across that really fit that comment I made before about the form following the function, where this organization had a specific charge and developed a committee to help meet that need between the staff and the full board. I think the other thing to point out that we haven't addressed yet on this episode is that beyond just your formal standing committees that are listed in your bylaws, it's very common to have things like task forces or advisory committees. And so, for example, let's say you're an organization that's getting ready to buy its first new building. It might not be uncommon to have a facilities task force, capital planning task force that exists for 3 to 5 years to help address that specific, immediate challenge.
Could you give us maybe in a tactical sense, let's say maybe it's an all volunteer board and the CEO is really trying to drive better usage of committees. And one of the things that they want to try and recommend is a little more structure. Like you mentioned, encouraging boards and committees to be data-driven. What are some examples of different structures maybe you've seen that work well for committees where maybe having some prescriptive recommendations or a template is helpful for them? Is it like we meet, every 2 weeks and we have a running Google Doc, or give us maybe some of the in the weeds recommendations?
Well, I think where you were getting at is really what we would recommend is to formalize it.
Okay.
So that can mean a lot of things. I mentioned before a job description for an individual board. We think every committee should have a job description that outlines why does this committee exist? What is its charge, essentially? From there, we want to formalize the cadence. So typically boards pick one of two different methods here. They either meet monthly on the same day as the full board, and they make it sort of a committee day or, right around the committee and the full board, or they meet on sort of like a biweekly cadence where 2 weeks, on a Tuesday, they might have a committee meeting. The next 2 weeks, they have a full board meeting. 2 weeks later, the committee meets. The importance is you want to have a formal, regular cadence, because the key here is you want to operate. I think it's like developing any personal life habit. You want to get into the cadence of this formal process, even if there isn't some compelling update. So what I recommend is that at every full board meeting, you have on every agenda an update from each one of your standing committees, even if there isn't some major agenda item, because there's nothing wrong with, to keep the example of the finance committee, there's nothing wrong with the finance committee getting up in February and announcing, hey, everybody, we don't have any major announcements, but as you know, we're working on the budget and we're going to be
right
next week. If you want to join that, let us know. Thanks. But what you're doing is, again, you're reinforcing the importance of these committees. You're helping to add some transparency to their work, and you're making it a regular habit that you're developing over time.
Yeah. Reinforcing the workflow so it becomes second nature.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, Mike, this was really interesting. And I'm sure people have lots of more questions about how they could bring kind of more effective governance and committee strategy to their schools. What, where can people go to learn more about your work? Do you have any recommended resources for schools of all shapes and sizes that know this is a growth opportunity for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a really unique model that combines our coaching and expertise that we've developed over a couple decades as really the leader in charter school governance, with a ton of tools and supports that help people to actually go out and do this work as easy as possible, right? Formalizing the committees in this example, using a data-driven governance tool So I would just encourage people to visit us on our website right here on my vest, BoardOnTrack. That's the simplest way to find us. You can actually find my direct contact info there as well. Mike at BoardOnTrack.com is my email. We have tons of free resources on our website that I've referenced on this call. So things like your charter school committee job descriptions, all of those can be accessed for free on our website. We also have a book that is on this exact topic. We're happy to share that with folks as well. If they want to reach out on our website, we're happy to mail some copies of those to folks and happy to share that link with you as well, Daniel.
All right, last question. Favorite non-Board on Track resource, book, podcast, article related to the world you're in?
Well, that is a really great question. For me, unfortunately, are there are a lot of the boring one is that there are a lot of law firms out there that put together newsletters, and especially where we are today, there's a lot of fast moving. And I'm not gonna,
right.
And so I really rely on those in my world as sort of like a compliance person to try.
Okay, cool.
So I'm happy to share some links with you. There's some law firms, especially in DC, that pump out weekly newsletters on the most updated topics, law firms, lawsuits that have been settled, things like that. That's what excites me the most, but that's going to excite your audience the same way.
All right. Well, if you don't subscribe to a law firm's newsletter, now is your opportunity. Plus, with AI, you can get the summary a lot faster, get the 3 bullet points. It's perfect. All right. Well, we'll link to those resources in the show notes. Mike, thanks so much for coming on and talking board governance and committees with us. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign-up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.